The G20 summit in New Delhi has been a resounding success. It's been a big win for India. That's how the entire world has seen it. This summit has showcased a strong, vibrant, confident, and rising India. An India that's a bridge between the East and the West, the North and the South, the developed world and the developing world. It's showcased an India that's a problem solver, an India that can build diplomatic consensus between opposing sides in the new Cold War, and it has showcased an India that will increasingly help shape the world order in the 2020s, this crucial decade of the 2020s. So please subscribe and let's analyze how India's historic G20 win will shape the world order during this crucial decade of the 2020s. So the first big win was achieving complete consensus in the G20 New Delhi Leaders Declaration. There was no dissent at all. So India ensured that all member states, all member nations and entities focused on finding common challenges and fighting those common challenges and not fighting each other. And the most complex part of the entire G20, like India's G20 Sherpa, Mr. Amitabh Kant, tweeted, was to bring consensus on the geopolitical paragraphs of the declaration, which they deal with Russia and Ukraine. And to achieve this, they had to do over 200 hours of non-stop negotiations. There were 300 bilateral meetings, and 15 drafts of the declaration were created until consensus could be finally achieved. So that's the amount of groundwork, legwork, and hard work, diplomatic skills, all that went into achieving consensus in the New Delhi Leaders Declaration. Now, you remember that last year in the SCO summit, Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit in Samarkand in September last year, Prime Minister Modi told President Putin that today's era is not an era of war. And a couple of months later, during the G20 Bali summit in Indonesia, which happened in mid-November, that phrase, today's era is not an era of war, was included in the G20 Bali Leaders Declaration. And this year as well, in the G20 New Delhi Leaders Declaration, that phrase that that today's era is not an era of war has been included as one of the key declarations in this document. So India has ensured that everybody focuses on not on war but on finding common ground and finding common challenges and addressing those challenges. So the New Delhi Leaders Declaration focuses on a number of things such as strong, sustainable, balanced and inclusive growth, accelerating progress on sustainable development goals, a green development pact for a sustainable future, multilateral institutions for the 21st century, which is quite important, and reinvigorating multilateralism. So India's G20 presidency has been the most ambitious and the most impactful presidency in the entire history of G20 presidencies. This has had 112 outcomes and presidency documents. India has more than tripled the substantive work from previous presidencies. So some of the major outcomes of India's presidency are, first of all, that the African Union has been admitted into the G20 and the G20 has now effectively become the G21. Then there's been full consensus on the Ukraine war, a full consensus Delhi declaration. Then the very important India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor. Then there's the Global Biofuels Alliance, and many more such outcomes have come out of India's presidency. And India's presidency has been the people's G20. So there have been more than 220 meetings in 60 cities all across the length and the breadth of India. Every state, every union territory has seen the G20 come to its territory. Over 100,000 delegates and participants have taken part in all these activities. So this is India has taken this to a whole different level. In previous presidencies in other nations, there have been a handful of meetings, and the people by large have not really participated in these presidencies. But India has taken this across the length and the breadth of the country. The people have participated. So this has been a true people's G20. India has shown the world how this can be done. And I think in the future, other nations will try to emulate what India has achieved during this year of its presidency. The second big win, like I said, is that the African Union has been inducted as a full member of the G20. And this has been done at India's insistence. This has been India's initiative. It's not Russia or China or any other nation that's taken this initiative. India has taken this initiative. And this is not just some random flash in the pan. India has walked the talk of leading the global south. For example, during the COVID pandemic, Indian vaccines and made in India vaccines were sent by India to about 100 countries. And these vaccines were given to countries that really needed them but could not afford them. And these vaccines were given for free. And about 150 nations imported medicines from India during this terrible phase, the COVID pandemic. And at the very beginning of India's presidency, India hosted a special summit, the Voice of the Global South Summit, in January this year. And representatives from 125 countries participated in the summit. Prime Minister Modi presided over the inaugural leaders session, and this was followed by 8 ministerial level segments dedicated to addressing the most pressing concerns of the developing world. And this summit ended with a concluding leaders session, which was also hosted by Prime Minister Modi. And India even ensured that the global south, the developing world, remained center stage at the G7 summit in Hiroshima in May this year. One of the criticisms of the G20 is that it's dominated by the world's richest countries, and they set the agenda and the terms, and the global south, the developing world, is kind of sidelined and not represented at the G20. And we know very well that the global south is very badly underrepresented at various international forums and even at UN meetings and conferences. So by inducting Africa into the G20 and ensuring that it gets the same status and the same role as the European Union, India has really walked the talk and ensured that the global south, the developing world, has a seat at the G20 and can participating in setting the agenda, and its voice will be heard now. And this, the world's largest continent, will now have a seat at the table. So this is a major step forward for the developing world and for Africa as a continent, and this has happened at India's initiative. No other country has done this. There have been so many G20 conferences and presidencies, but India is the nation that made this major eventuality happen. So big win for India. That's the second big win for India. The third big win that we saw is this rapprochement that we saw between Saudi Arabia and the West. So in 2018, there was the Khashoggi incident, the assassination of Jamal Khashoggi, and because of this, the West, the US, and the EU, etc., they kind of targeted Mohammed bin Salman, Mr. Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. So the assassination happened in October 2018, and a couple of months later, November, December 2018, there was the Buenos Aires G20 summit that took place, and Mr. Mohammed bin Salman participated in that, but he was completely isolated. He was sidelined. He was made to feel like an outsider, like a pariah. I think only Prime Minister Modi and maybe a couple of other leaders would have spoken with him. He was completely sidelined, and afterwards, the Biden administration went very strongly after Saudi Arabia. And they have kind of demonized Mr. Mohammed bin Salman. And as a result of all this, Saudi Arabia has kind of been distancing itself from the West and looking at alternatives in other nations. For example, China has now gotten involved in the Middle East. President Xi Jinping recently visited Saudi Arabia, and many agreements were signed. And it was all essentially all about the trade in oil. Obviously, China needs oil. They need energy security. And Saudi Arabia and China have been trading in oil. And the currency they've been using is the Chinese yuan. So Saudi Arabia is kind of distancing itself from the US dollar, kind of, looking at alternative currencies. In the aftermath of the Ukraine war, the US wanted Saudi Arabia to ramp up oil production to ease domestic pressures, but Saudi Arabia did the opposite. They cut down oil production by a certain percentage. So the Saudis have been not towing the line of the West, of the US, and this has caused a considerable amount of strain and friction in the relationship. Saudi Arabia recently, it has been announced that they're going to become part of BRICS from the 1st of January next year. So a lot is happening. Saudi Arabia as a nation has been drifting away from the West because of Western pressures. And in this summit, the West and Saudi Arabia are essentially have not been on speaking terms with each other. So this in this summit, you saw a kind of a rapprochement. You saw the Mohammed bin Salman and Biden shaking hands with Mr. Modi between them and holding their hands. So there was a very striking image that came out of this summit. Mr. Mohammed bin Salman also spoke warmly with the president of the European Commission, Mrs. Ursula von der Leyen. So you can see that India has made this happen. India has made Saudi Arabia come together with the West again. Saudi Arabia is an Eastern nation. It's a member of BRICS now, more or less. It's soon to be a member of BRICS. So India is bridging the gap between the East and the West, BRICS and NATO, that sort of thing. So that's a significant. I mean, it may look like just optics, but it's a significant step forward in international geopolitics and diplomacy. So that's something that India made happen. The next big win is the India Middle East Europe Economic Corridor. So this was announced via a memorandum of understanding (MOU) that was unveiled during the G20 summit in New Delhi. And the nations that are participating, there are signatories to the MOU are India, the United States, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, France, Germany, Italy, and the European Union. So the US, even though it's not geographically part of this, is very much at the forefront in this, along with India and these other nations. And this trade corridor, this economic corridor, will also involve other nations like Jordan, like Israel, and Greece. And interestingly, this economic corridor bypasses Turkey. And the president of the UAE, Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan, said that negotiations should be completed within the next 2 months, within the next 60 days, and the foundations of this project should be laid immediately. So as you can see, there's a very strong urgency to get this project going, and this project is very soon going to hit the ground running. So what is this project? It's a transnational rail and shipping route. So one end is India, the other end is the EU, and there's going to be shipping and railway links spread across two continents. These shipping and railway lines will pass through the UAE and Saudi Arabia. They will go through Jordan and Israel, and they will then reach Greece and Europe. So this corridor will cut shipping times by about 40%, and it's going to save a lot of money on other costs and fuel and all that. And it's estimated to require an initial investment or a full investment of about $17 billion. It's projected to give annual returns of $4 billion, and it's going to create at least 100,000 new jobs. And it's going to stimulate economic development through improved connectivity and integrated economic integration between Asia, essentially India, the Middle East, the Arabian Gulf nations, and Europe. So one end is India, the other end is Europe. And this is not something that was dreamt up suddenly or very recently. The genesis of this corridor, the IMEC corridor, lies in a forum that was created about 2 years ago. It was called I2U2. It comprised India, Israel, I2, the UAE and the US, that's U2. And Saudi Arabia was later made a part of this grouping, and this has now been expanded and magnified into the India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor. And like I said, Turkey has been bypassed. Turkey is not part of this, and President Erdogan is obviously not happy about this. And he said that this should include Turkey. The most convenient line for traffic from east to west has to pass through Turkey. Now, Turkey has for the longest time leveraged its geographic, very important, very strategic geographic position for geopolitical rent seeking. It's been kind of a problematic nation for NATO. The US have not been happy about Turkey's decision to purchase the S-400 system from Russia. They denied Turkey the F-35 fighter, and Turkey has geopolitical and imperial ambitions of its own. It's involved in the imbroglio that's happening between Azerbaijan and Armenia. So Turkey and Turkey has been very anti-India consistently for a very long time. So Turkey is being bypassed out of this. Now this new trade corridor, the IMEC trade corridor, is going to be a competitor, a rival, and an alternative to China's Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI, and the corresponding Maritime Silk Route. So the BRI is kind of dead in the water. It's not really progressing. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which is the part of the BRI, has failed. The BRI bypasses Russia more or less because it passes through Central Asia, and it's all about China. The BRI is all about China. It's about Chinese companies, Chinese infrastructure. All the infrastructure is created by Chinese companies and Chinese labor. China gives loans to nations to finance the infrastructure construction, and these loans often end up putting those nations in debt traps. That's what we know. The whole world knows about it about this by now. So this is going to be a very good alternative for nations that do not wish to be a part of the BRI and who are not comfortable being part of the BRI. And one of the major developments that's happened in Delhi itself is that Italy has pulled out of the BRI. Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni informed Chinese Premier Li Qiang that Italy is pulling out of the BRI. Italy will no longer participate, and this could, precipitate other nations also eventually pulling out of the BRI and choosing to become part of the IMEC corridor. But IMEC is right now, no, it's not yet started. It will take a few years to take off and become established. So it's going to be a while before IMEC becomes a reality. But it's going to happen. And there are other trade routes also that are being planned right now. For example, there's the Eastern Maritime Corridor, the EMC, which will be between Chennai and Vladivostok, which is being planned by India and Russia. Like I said, the BRI bypasses Russia more or less. And I expect that an Eastern India, ASEAN, Japan, Australia kind of trade corridor will also happen soon. It just makes sense. So India eventually could end up being the center of these two major trade and economic corridors, and it just makes sense. So yeah, this is a major development that's been a major outcome of the G20 summit that happened in New Delhi. Another big win is that India-US relations have visibly strengthened, and Prime Minister Modi has been working very hard, very assiduously on this for many years. There was a very good bilateral interaction between Prime Minister Modi and President Biden, and you can see that relations are visibly stronger, they're visibly warmer. A few months ago, I had said that the US, in the aftermath of the Ukraine war, India had refused to participate in US and Western-led sanctions against Russia. India had refused to condemn Russia, and India had actually ramped up buying Russian oil, and the West was very displeased with that. You saw a big outpouring of articles and commentaries and social media posts by think tanks and various thinkers and academics, all castigating India, saying that India is on the wrong side of history and whatnot. And I said that there could be an uptick of this, and the West may perhaps want to see a regime change in India in 24 when the elections happen. But now we can see the opposite happening. Mr. Modi and his team have really worked hard to synergize India-Western relations, India-US relations, and you can now see a visible a decrease in such articles coming out of the US and such commentaries coming out of the US. You still see such articles coming out of the UK. The UK doesn't really matter. And such articles also come out of the French media, the German media. But the US media has ramped it down significantly. So now I believe the US now sees India as a major bulwark against China. The Cold War is in full swing now. The Cold War 2.0, the US-led bloc versus the Chinese-led bloc. And India is the only nation in Asia that can, counterbalance China and stand up to China. And the US needs India in this regard. So there is a significant convergence of geopolitical and strategic interests and national interests. And you can see a visible strengthening of India-US relations, which is a great positive. India-Italy relations have also strengthened considerably. You saw that Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni had very good and positive interactions during the summit. India-EU relations also are very strong, and they're further strengthened as a consequence of India's presidency of the G20. And an interesting thing is that Canada's Prime Minister, Mr. Trudeau, He did participate in the summit, but he was kind of isolated. Nobody paid much heed to him, and he failed to secure a bilateral um, meeting with with Prime Minister Modi, and eventually a small, brief bilateral meeting did happen. A pull aside meeting in which Justin Trudeau ended up being scolded by Prime Minister Modi for the very strong anti India activities that are happening in Canada under Justin Trudeau's government. So, and if you see the photograph that the Canadians released, the best picture that they could find, Trudeau looks like an errant schoolboy who has been summoned to the principal's office and been given a very strong scolding. That's how he looks in that picture. And Trudeau skipped the G20 dinner that was hosted by Prime Minister Modi, so he ended up isolated. This is not a reflection on Canada as a whole, as a nation. It's a reflection on Justin Trudeau. So overall, India and the West, the relations have been significantly strengthened. The other big win for India, the next big win, is that India-Russia relations remain unaffected. And Russia actually may be quite grateful to India for ensuring that there was no censure or condemnation of Russia in the leaders' declaration, in the final declaration. Because in Bali last year, there was some condemnation of Russia, a rather strong language was used. This year, there's been no such thing, and Russia was very much part of the consensus that led to the final leaders' declaration. That was the outcome of the New Delhi summit. So India-Russia relations remain unaffected despite India-Western relations becoming stronger. So that's a great win for India. India is kind of bridging the gap between the East and the West, between the Russian side of the world and the US and NATO and Western side of the world. India is a bridge. India has friendly relations with everyone except for China. And when it comes to China, it's not India's fault. China is an imperialistic, hegemonic, expansionist nation, and whatever frictions and tensions exist between India and China are entirely of China's doing. India has not started any of that. The whole world knows this. So that brings me to the last point, that China essentially in this summit was invisible and it made almost no impact. First of all, President Xi Jinping chose not to attend the summit. He sent the Chinese Premier Li Qiang as his representative. And China throughout India's presidency has demonstrated a very petty, jealous, obstructionist attitude. They tried to impede India at every step of the way. They even objected to India using Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam as this year's motto. Their justification was that Sanskrit is not one of the approved languages. They have tried to obstruct everything. They have contributed next to nothing to India's presidency. During the summit, China was more or less invisible, non-impactful, and China made a negligible contribution to the New Delhi leaders' declaration. And this is because of China's self-centric, self-centered approach. By not attending the summit, President Xi Jinping demonstrated that he is not concerned about issues that concern G20, such as and the global South, like inclusive development. He's not concerned about the global South. He's not concerned about economic and social empowerment, bridging the digital divide, securing food security and nutrition, and driving inclusive climate action, and all these points that are on the G20 agenda. China doesn't seem to be interested in this. China is only interested in its own progress and furthering its own ambitions. China has signaled to the world that it's not a responsible member of the International Committee of Nations. China believes in a zero-sum approach. Others have to lose for China to win. We can't all win together. China won't allow that. Others have to lose for China to win. So, and the India-Middle East-Europe Economic Corridor has emerged as an alternative to the BRI. Even Russia would not mind that, because Russia is mostly bypassed by the BRI. And this... And Italy has pulled out of the BRI. So this could signal a growing trend in the coming years of this decade, that more nations could seek to decouple with China, disengage with China, and seek alternatives, which could possibly be led by India and other nations. So yeah, so China has been one of the big losers when it comes to, apart from along with Justin Trudeau. when it comes to the G20 summit in New Delhi this year. So overall, the G20 summit, the New Delhi summit, was a major win for India. It was a major win for the global South. India went well above and beyond in its G20 presidency. India exceeded all the expectations and over delivered. India succeeded in bringing nations together despite their differences. And today, India is rising, India is growing, India is a confident, vibrant nation. India is going to be the third largest economy in the world very soon. And India is not an imperialistic country, a hegemonic country, an expansionist nation. India is a force for good, and that's what India has demonstrated in this summit. So the 2020s, this decade, are going to be a decade of great geopolitical change, very rapid geopolitical change and realignment. And India's success in its G20 presidency could be a harbinger of things to come in this decade. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video.